So if the prevalence rate for cocaine for the 15-19 age group is 15, it means that 15% of the individuals in that age group have tried cocaine at least once at some point. That is typically the gold standard of drug policymakers to look at drug usage rates. And what you see in this chart, which compares 2001, that was the year that decriminalization first took effect, although it took effect in October. So most of 2001 was under Portugal's harsh decriminalization scheme. What you see is that in every category of narcotic, obviously methadone, K, GHB are new drugs and weren't studied in 2001, but heroin, mushrooms, LSD, amphetamines, cocaine, ecstasy, and marijuana have fairly substantial decreases from the last year of criminalization, 2001, to 2006, which is 5 years or 4 full years after decriminalization. And that's for what essentially is the 10th to 12th grade equivalents for the Portuguese. And drug policymakers are ecstatic about this chart, as I think it's not hard to understand why. Figure 6, which is on page 14, I think is the one that they will point to the most, even though it might not be as immediately compelling. These show lifetime prevalence rates for all drugs for 3 different population groups: 15 to 24-year-old, 15 to 19-year-old, 20 to 24-year-olds. And this compares 2001 and 2007. And although there's some mild increases in the 15 to 24 group and the 20 to 24 group, though far less than the increases in virtually every other Western European country during this period. In the 15 to 19 age group, what essentially are high school students, by far the most significant demographic group for understanding the effects of legalization and how attitudes about drugs are formed, on an absolute basis, usage rates have decreased from the last year of criminalization to 6 years later. And I think that is extraordinarily compelling. And you know, I think at the end of the day, what these 2 charts show about the absolute drug usage rate is that you can debate whether or not it's fair to say that decriminalization has decreased drug usage. Clearly, in some demographic categories, it has. In other demographic categories, there are some mild increases. But what is absolutely clear is that it is unreasonable to suggest that there's any evidence at all that decriminalization has led to the kind of significant increases in drug usage that opponents of decriminalization invariably predict, and in Portugal insisted would occur. Those have just been empirically disproven. Now, I just want to briefly touch upon some of the comparative statistics that are most compelling when you look at Portugal versus the EU. And I want to just say a word about
just to gauge on the time, about 3 minutes.
Sure. About statistics and drug data and the like. It's very difficult to gather drug data that remains completely consistent over the years. And it's especially difficult to compare drug data between different countries because different countries have different methodologies. The questions they ask are different. Countries with resource constraints have difficulty studying these issues consistently. And so it's certainly the case that there are always gaps in this kind of data. It doesn't have the sort of mathematical exactitude that, say, economic data from a first world country might offer. But I don't think anyone doubts that they are, in general, reliable barometers for what is taking place. And if you look at figure 15 on page 21, and this is actually compiled both by the Portuguese agency and by the principal European Drug Monitoring Agency, which also by coincidence is based in Lisbon. What this does is it compares prevalence rates from many EU states for marijuana for the ages of 15 to 64. And you can see that Portugal, as compared to all of these states with harsh criminalization schemes, has the lowest prevalence rate for marijuana as compared to any of those other countries. I'm just going to skip this one here in just a second. Figure 17, which is on page 24, has the prevalence rates for that same age group, 15 to 64 years, for cocaine. And Portugal is very close to the bottom post-decriminalization as compared to Eastern European countries. And in fact, some of the countries with the harshest criminalization schemes, like Great Britain and Estonia, have not just higher rates for cocaine, but 5 to 6 to 7 times higher rates. And across the board, if you look at the number of deaths related to drugs in Portugal and compare the skyrocketing rates in the 1990s to what has happened to post-decriminalization, you find substantial improvements, just as a pure matter of empiricism, in virtually every one of these categories. And so I think that if you want to look at what the arguments were against decriminalization in Portugal and what they are in the United States anytime you raise the prospect, the strongest empirical evidence is that those predictions end up being untrue. And what decriminalization does is not only enable policymakers to reach the population in a much healthier and more candid way, it actually enables these problems to be brought under control much more effectively than where criminalization remains. And I think once that assumption in our drug policy debate is gutted, which this evidence in the most rational sense does, that decriminalization leads to an explosion of usage rates, I think that is what can really transform drug policy debate in the United States from this sort of moral and irrational driven discussion into something that is much more serious and substantive and adult. And I just hope that people begin to look at these questions based on evidence like this rather than on the sort of emotion-driven dialogue that we've had for decades in this country surrounding drug use. So thanks very much for listening. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Okay, we are now going to have the benefit of hearing another, perhaps more skeptical view of the Portuguese model. Dr. Peter Reuter is a well-known expert in drug policy circles. He has testified before the Congress several times about crime and drugs, and he has also served as a consultant to various government agencies, not only in the United States, but also with government agencies abroad. Dr. Reuter is widely published in the field of drug policy and criminology, co-publishing several books, and he's published widely in the scholarly journals. Since 1985, most of his research has dealt with alternative approaches to controlling drug problems both in the United States and in Western Europe. He teaches at the University of Maryland, and he is the director of that university's Center on the Economics of Crime and Justice Policy. So would you please welcome Dr. Peter Reuter.
Thank you very much. My skepticism apparently is notorious, and it's entirely an accurate characterization of me. First, let me say I'm delighted by two aspects of this event. One is an excellent study of a small foreign country, and I think the introduction was entirely right. It's nice to know we can learn from somewhere far away that none of us have really know anything about. And secondly, such a large turnout. I have not talked to an audience of this size in Washington about drug policy for a long time. I do some work related to money laundering, and that involves money, and so there are larger audiences for that. But drug policy has been sort of a, well, not a very promising topic for audiences. So let me start by saying that I think it is fair to say that decriminalization in Portugal has indeed, as Glenn's documented, achieved its central goals. Drug use did not rise. I mean, the standard concern is that it would indeed lead to a large increase. All the evidence on decriminalization with respect to cannabis, I spent a lot of time in Europe, so I say cannabis rather than marijuana, and it seems appropriate here, is consistent with that very either no increase or very small increase from decriminalization. But this is, of course, much broader than cannabis, and it's a very useful addition to that literature to say that decriminalization turned out not to lead to a substantial increase. It didn't lead to Portugal becoming a tourist destination, and tourism is very important to a drug tourist destination. Tourism is very important to Portugal. I think it's worth noting that Spain is also a decriminalization country, not merely for cannabis, but for drugs generally. There are some subtle differences in the two regimes. It may be that if you're planning to smoke dope, Spain continues to be just as attractive as Portugal for those purposes. And the Portuguese regime is very oriented towards local use rather than foreign users. It picks up almost no foreign users, and I suspect that the police are particularly uninterested in foreign users, but they've not become reputed to be a drug tourist destination. I have a question about whether it has succeeded in reducing the intrusiveness of the state. A standard problem with cannabis decriminalization is what's called in the criminal justice literature net widening, which is now the police don't have to put as much effort into processing an arrest, and they go out and make many more arrests when the penalties are reduced. That has been the experience both in the UK and in some Australian jurisdictions. We've seen a huge increase in the number of arrests, even though those arrests result in non-criminal processing of the arrestee. In the case of Portugal, it appears that more people are processed in administrative proceedings post-2001 than were arrested for drug use prior to that. But I know enough about criminal justice statistics in foreign countries to know that interpretation is very difficult, and maybe what I read as arrests is really some other part of the process, so I could be wrong about that. But I have some concern that police in Portugal, as in other countries, have, in a sense, taken advantage of this and brought more people into the net, even though the consequence for an individual is much less benign. My skepticism is going to get expressed in two forms. One is, how big a change is this really in policy terms? And the second one is consistent with a comment of Glenn's at the end of his presentation, which is, gee, how much can we associate policy change with the changes that we observe in terms of drug use and drug-related harms? It's worth noting that there are two other European countries that have essentially decriminalized all drugs, Italy and Spain. Spain is mentioned in Glenn's study. I don't think Italy is. The Italian experience is sort of interesting. They had a conventional criminalization regime through the mid-70s. They started to see a rising number of heroin-related deaths. And they believed, as the experts in Portugal said in 2008, that the criminal law got in the way of heroin addicts approaching the treatment system. And so they saw that rise in heroin deaths as probably related to the criminalization. So they decriminalized in about 1975. The number of heroin-related deaths continued to rise. In 1990, they reversed and went back to criminalization, and then by an almost, just fortuitously, they re-decriminalized in 1993. From some points of view, just wonderful to study this. If only the Italians would collect some data, but they don't. So, all one can say is something about the number of drug-related deaths. And Spain really, as part of the We're Beyond Franco regime, decriminalized shortly after Franco's death, really to reduce the intrusiveness of the state as much as anything, as much as it was a statement about drug policy. Now I've said, but maybe the change isn't actually all that important to change. And what I mean by that is I'm skeptical of the claim that it was the criminal statute that sort of restricted, that limited so someone who was drug dependent from seeking treatment. And let me offer some evidence from other countries. In countries with perfectly conventional criminal justice approaches to the drug problem, like Australia and the UK, you have treatment take-up rates of about 60%. That is, if you look at the heroin-dependent population, between 50 and 60% of them are in treatment at any one time. It's, maybe given Portugal's history of a repressive regime from the Salazar era, there was the criminal law stands as a bigger barrier for treatment seeking than it would in countries without that history, like Australia and